I'm joined now by Dr. Kamal Helbawi of the Muslim Brotherhood, by Douglas Murray, author of Neoconservatism, Why We Need It, Dr. Vivian Ibrahim from the School of Oriental and African Studies here in London, and from Washington by Martin Indyk, who has worked for several US presidents on the Middle East, and this week was invited to discuss strategy towards Egypt with President Obama. Dr. Helbawi, first of all, is the Muslim Brotherhood a threat?
I lived in the Muslim Brotherhood since 1952. If I have found them any threat to the life or property or have any specific agenda that is not known, I would never be a member in that Muslim Brotherhood.
We heard Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iran today, say that he welcomes what he calls the Islamic liberation movement in Egypt, and he seemed to be meaning you.
We are not an Islamic liberation movement. We have no occupation external coming from outside. We have injustice in the society. We have dictatorship. We have seen poverty spreading everywhere in the society. We have seen people living in the graveyards. We have seen people, most of the society, more than 50% of the citizens, either at the poverty level or under the poverty level.
Okay, but Douglas, why? I mean, when the Muslim Brotherhood say quite clearly we want pluralism, we want freedom, we want democracy, we want the things that you want, you see them as a threat.
Well, there's no reason whatsoever to believe them, is the reason. Just earlier this week, one of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood said in an interview that the country of Egypt should prepare to shut the Suez Canal and prepare for war with Egypt. Dr. Helbawi, who spoke so beautifully just now, in a BBC interview in 2008, said that even 2-year-old Israeli children were acceptable targets for terrorism. There is no reason at all to believe the Muslim Brotherhood. There wasn't when their faction, the Hamas, took over the Gaza, when they said that when they did so in a democratic election, and then, of course, last year when they meant to have another election, didn't have it. They're a one vote once party. That's what the Muslim Brotherhood is.
This is really a big lie, and I never said so in my life.
You said it on the BBC, Dr. Helbawi.
Everyone can see it. Bring it, and tell me who is representing the Muslim Brotherhood and said we will shut or
no, I can tell you, Mohammed Gamin, he said it earlier this week, Mohammed Gamin.
Let me bring in Dr. Ibrahim on this.
I mean, representing the Muslim Brotherhood.
We'll come back to you. Dr. Ibrahim, I mean, where do you see this? Because we've heard on the one hand this is a big threat to Egypt, a big potential threat. It's a big threat to Western interests, which we hear from some Western capitals. On the other hand, I've heard from many Egyptians, this is not a threat, it's just part of the puzzle.
I think we have to look at the broader issue here. Yes, the Muslim Brotherhood are one aspect of post whatever happens to Mubarak. But on top of that, we have a system in place. So this idea that we're going to descend into chaos, that the Muslim Brotherhood are going to take over, is not necessarily the reality. I mean, there's a constitution, and there are several outcomes to the possible, there are 3 or 4 different clauses of the constitution that can be taken from this point onwards. And each one of them secures free elections. It will secure an interim government. And from that point, we can start to have a discussion which is more inclusive of a wider spectrum of Egyptian society.
Well, let me bring in Martin Indyk now from Washington. I mean, is it possible that Mubarak could go, will go soon, and that broadly the same people will stay in power, as we have seen in Tunisia?
Let me just correct one thing. I didn't meet with President Obama this week. I met with a few of his advisors, along with a lot of other people. Look, I think it is more than likely that President Mubarak will leave office of president soon. I don't see any way in which he will stay till September, not just because of the incredible demonstrations that we see that are likely to continue until he steps down, but also because I think he knows, having made the decision that he's not going to run again, I think he knows that it's all up for him. As for what happens after him, look, it's a military regime. It's been a military regime since 1952. It's no coincidence that all the people that he's appointed in the new cabinet are military officers. But you can see that the army has a role that's different from the presidency. And the people are willing to accept that there's some distance between the Mubarak and the army. I mean, the defense minister was able to walk into the crowds today. So I think that there is a potential for the army to play the responsible role of holding the ring and overseeing the transition process to free and democratic elections. And that's the hope that we've got to work with.
Dr. Ibrahim, I mean, the army in control, as one might say it has been since 1952, one way or another with a civilian facade, so nothing much will change.
That's one possibility. I mean, we have a couple of possibilities. If Mubarak steps down tomorrow, the Vice President is in place. According to the Constitution, what will happen is he has the powers, as long as he appoints to the Vice President certain powers, he has the powers to enact constitutional changes to a degree. However, if he doesn't give the Vice President those powers, and he hasn't done so yet, the reality is that we will go to elections in 60 days' time. And that's a different scenario.
Do you, Douglas Murray, do you actually want Egypt to be a democracy? Because
of course.
you do, but I mean, you're happy with democracy in Gaza?
Which
turned up with a Hamas.
But it isn't democracy in Gaza. If you have one election once, it's not a democracy. If you have a
well, you think if Hamas were to run again, they wouldn't win in Gaza?
If you have a party that comes to power, and when it comes to power murders its opposition movements, as Hamas did in Gaza, and then doesn't have the next election, that isn't a democracy. I hope that Egypt is a democracy in the region, of a genuine kind, not of the kind the Muslim Brotherhood would institute. And a genuine democracy, and to see that in Egypt, we have to see a transitionary process where parties other than the Muslim Brotherhood have an opportunity to unite, cohere, and provide a decent, credible alternative other than the clerical fascist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood.
I know that the conservatives and the Zionists would like Muslim Brotherhood to leave Egypt, and they can create democracy of their like. Let me tell you clearly, and tell my friend, that if there is no proper democracy in Egypt, forget about Muslim Brotherhood. We don't like to come to power. We need to see our country in proper democracy. We don't like to come to power.
Unless it's a proper democracy.
Let me complete.
Okay.
Let me complete.
Please do.
I'm afraid lest America and the West will try to have dialogue with any Qaeda or Taliban that will come secretly if these protesters and the revolution come to an end by force.
Okay, but let me bring in Martin Inda. I mean, do you think it's in America's interest to have Egypt as a democracy?
Very much so. It's very much our values, what we believe in, and the President has made very clear that he supports the demand for free and fair elections and for a democratic
even if it would be more hostile, even if it were a country that would be more hostile to Israel, a country which perhaps would see the border crossings into Gaza as something that should be opened up, things that are not what America wants to see.
Of course, this is a very risky situation in terms of American interests in the region. But the people of Egypt are speaking in Tahrir Square, and the tide has turned, and there's no way that it can be turned back. There are plenty of other examples in different parts of the world, Indonesia, for example, where Muslim societies have gone through this transition to democracies, and it worked out quite well. So we don't have a choice here but to try to help shape the process in an orderly and peaceful way that will lead to Egyptian democracy. And that is a huge deal. If that happens in the Middle East, that is going to have profound consequences across the region. Some of them will be very bad, and some of them may be very good, but we're just going to have to go with the tide of history.
Go with the tide of history, Douglas Murray.
Absolutely. The tide of history is across the Middle East. It has been since 2003, when Iraq was liberated, in 2005, when Iraq had the sight of the Iraqi people going to the polls for the first time in a genuine election. Since then, it's been obvious to some that
the Arab history in 1979 in Iran was a revolution which started on one path, ended up in another path.
Yes, it can go the other way, and there's no doubt about it that Egypt at the moment could go either of those ways. It could go the path of Iran, go backwards, throw a great civilization backwards in time, or it could be the moment where the Egyptian people have control of their country for the first time.
And the violence in Iraq, since America occupied Iraq, is 100% more than the time of Saddam
Dr.
Hussein.
Helbawi, I wanted to ask you about the Iran comparison.
Hosni Mubarak
Okay.
is a worse terrorist than Saddam Hussein, and the West is tolerating him for 30 years.
Okay.
We are suffering 30 years.
Do you see any comparisons with Iran?
What we're looking at here is we're looking ideologically, but there's the reality that's on the ground in Egypt and what we can see right now. So ideologically, we're saying the Muslim Brotherhood are the potential huge threat. We're thinking sort of very much in Western terms, but the reality is, on the ground, the protests that we've seen over the last 10, 11 days have been from a wide spectrum of Egyptian society, from different social, political and religious backgrounds.
And you talked to them. You were
I did
in
talk to
constant
them.
contact.
I'm in constant contact with people. The situation on the ground changes on a very fast daily basis. But what we see is, activists standing side by side beside someone who is just looking for their daily bread. And so this social movement is what we should be concentrating on. The idea that this is about internal affairs, about Egypt, and is not about the wider geopolitical situation. Yes, there are knock-on effects, but right now, what those people are protesting about are internal affairs.
And just a final thought from Martin Indyk. I mean, isn't the likeliest outcome of this that the army will in the end assert itself, and it will be for patriotic reasons, it will have the support of many people because it will bring stability?
If you mean asserting itself by cracking down on the demonstrators and repeating what we saw in Tiananmen Square in China, I don't think that's going to happen here. I think that the military have made absolutely clear they're not going to fire on the demonstrators. And by the way, that's partly because of the influence of President Obama and the American military, who are making it clear to their counterparts that this is just not on. So I think that what we're going to see here is a transition. It's hard to believe it's going to be orderly or peaceful, but I do think that there is a good chance here that we can see a process evolve in which free and fair elections can take place, and Egypt will become the first and most profound expression of the will of the people in the Arab world that we have seen in history.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much.